Hi everybody. Starting the video with the disclaimer. This is my fourth day of studying Kotlin. Though my channel name is the Kotlin King, that reflects my aspiration, not the current situation. In this video, I go through things that I learned recently. So in the previous video, we went through very basic functions that print text to the screen. Now, in this lesson, we're going to look at more useful functions. And I like to think of more useful functions um, as those that modify and transfer info. And we're going to look at functions that here, two examples that end with the word return. And you're going to see that a lot. Almost all of the time, you'll see the word return. And I like to think of the word return as um, it telling the function what information to transfer. Not transfer to be used, transfer to be displayed later, but again, what information is being transferred or returned as a result of the function. So if we look at the first example, a function called add2numbers, it requires two variables, also called parameters, but I'm going to think of it as two pieces of information. Number one, that's the variable name, which is an integer, and number two, which is also an integer. Important thing here, I'm emphasizing the last lesson, doesn't matter what variable name it is, as long as this and this are the same, and this are the same. Notice how they get highlighted. Now, this is something we didn't see before in the previous um, functions that just printed out text. This function is actually going to return information, and the function needs to know what type of information it is going to return. And here we have to specify it is an integer that the function is going to return. And this needs to be declared if the function has the word return. And I think this is worth discussing. What does return mean intuitively? And I think the best way I could explain it is in the end, we have these functions, useful functions in our programs because we need to modify and transfer information, right? Amongst amongst within the program, information gets transferred, and while it gets transferred, it gets modified and then transferred. The function needs to know what information is actually going to be transferred or returned, right? Um, Previous examples of the functions just generated text on the screen, but that's obviously not very useful. That's a very limited function. But of course, information needs to get transferred around, and return is a way of for the function to know what information am I going to be returning or transferring um, somewhere within the program. So I think moving on, and again, that will take a little bit of time to fully grasp, and I think seeing different functions work again and again, I think helped with the intuition, but I wish I actually thought of it this way too, because before I would always think, what is it returning? What is it returning? Like it's not doing anything. I think because we start off our programming with so many print line, print this, let me show up on the screen, um, I think that is where some of the confusion comes from. That I don't see any information to be returned, but to me, but when I realize it's just functions are supposed to again modify and transfer information, it made me look at things differently. It wasn't about me seeing the info, it was me understanding that it is a information transferring mechanism, and return is the best way. Well, not the best way. I think it might be the only way that the function knows how to do that. Um, so moving on, we declare a variable here called total. Again, this could have been anything. I could have called it total. I could have called it sum. I could have called it x. Um, but I I state that the variable total it equals number one plus number two. Um, and what I have to do is then write return total. This tells the function that to keep that this is the information that the function is going to transfer. Don't know exactly where yet. You don't know where it's going to be transferred and how it's going to be used, but if it's going to be used, this is the information that the function generates to be used. Now, I do want to say one thing is here we declare a variable and then we return it. And this is done this way to make it clean to look at. But instead of writing these two lines, I could have just written this, return number one plus number two, because the sum of the two integers is the information that the function is going to transfer. This is a nice way of doing that. Is I don't know if it's the more accepted way. It depends, I guess, on the complexity of what it's doing, but it would have done the same thing. In the end, all the function is doing is taking two numbers, generating the sum, and taking that value, the sum value, and transferring it somewhere. So let's see. Um, we're going to write print line, and we'll do add two numbers. And remember, it requires two integers. I'm just going to put 5, comma, 7, right? And notice one thing, be careful with the parentheses, like the double parentheses. Um, sounds almost silly, but I've seen a lot of typos. I shouldn't say, I've made a lot of typos um, with those kind of parentheses, so watch out for that. And as expected, it generates the number the 12, which is the sum of 5 plus 7. But again, stepping back for a second, that is obvious. But let's again remember what this did. Print line just prints out the 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 text is given to them, the number that is given to the function. This function generated the information of 12 by calculating 5 plus 7 and transferred it to print line. If you start seeing the whole world of functions like this, I think it'll really help. I think it really helps me now. Um, Again, before I had a rough time with what return meant intuitively because I didn't see it. I was operating out of a print world. I didn't see it on the screen. But when I started to understand it more in the abstract as information that is being transferred, it really helped. Now, again, it's going to help with understanding this as well. I'm declaring a variable called sum, right? And sum is equal to the result of this function. Add two numbers, 5 plus 7, right? Now, while the answer is obvious why this is 12, again, what does this function do? It returns a number, information. It transfers the number 12 to this variable. So this variable now equals number 12. That's all the function does. It returns a number, it transfers it does things, but what it delivers on is the number 12 after it calculates the sum. And then with that information, you could assign it or you could give it to the variable sum. I will print this out here just for completion. But you'll see that before when variables will be assigned or declared with a result of a function, that used to confuse me until I started looking at this as a piece of information that has been calculated and then being transferred. That helped my intuition of functions a lot. This is just another example. So we mix mix it up a little bit. This is a example where you use there's a function called dog info. Take two pieces of information, one called name and one called age. Again, this variable could have been called anything. Um, but again, it's good to use ones that of course make some sense. Name is a string and age is an integer. Straightforward. But here, what this function is going to return, or the type of information is going to end up transferring, is a string. Okay? And what is it returning? Here it is going to return text that says my dog's name is um, the information you gave it. So see here is linked. Again, it could have been called anything. Um, and here, age is used here. Again, I think in the first two lessons I said best practice is to use curly braces, but I mean I think just for it's actually perfectly fine to use it like without curly braces here because we're not doing anything to the variable and it's cleaner to look at. It's almost like just reading text. So I'm just gonna do it that way. Um, I think I mentioned this before, but just always remember where the curly braces go. I know that sounds simple when you just look at these examples, but um, just getting in the habit of being comfortable writing parentheses, curly braces, and of I think is really good practice. Um, but what does this function do? It returns a piece of info, which is text, and this is being transferred. I like to think of this as being transferred. I don't, you know, it's not returning, it's not doing, it's not generating, but this information is being transferred. And let's see how it's being used. I declare a variable called sentence, and I write, let me just write it myself. The dog name is uh, Coder, and the age, there's probably 30 is probably too much. 10, right? Pretty straightforward, but again, this function, by me providing the variables coder and 10, it's gonna give me back a text, a piece of info that I can now say is sentence is equal to that piece of info, right? And let's see what it does. And with that sentence, I can now put it into the print function. So it's a transfer. One again, it's a transfer of information. It transfers it here. This function generates information that goes into the variable, and this variable goes into the print line function. Again, these are relatively simple examples, but I still think there's a lot of little nuances here that once you really internalize and understand it as intuition, as information being transferred around by the functions, where the function modifies it and it does calculations and modifies it or does calculations. I just repeated that twice. Um, and and then it gets the information, it calculates the information, modifies the information, and then it passes it around to other places of of the your choice, the program's choice, by returning it. And I think it's a significant concept that at least it took me uh, quite a while to understand that I think could be really helpful, especially after these. I think that we go into conditionals, lists, arrays. I've noticed in many different programming courses that complexity picks up quick after like right about here. Um, because here is almost like English, and other areas it becoming is a little bit more programming syntax like. So I wanted to spend a lot of time here just really drilling in what I think is was for me the best intuition to understand what functions are doing. All right, I'm gonna end the video there. Thank you very much.